Okay, we are starting in chapter 4. It's the Ancient Aegean chapter. We're still in content area 2 and will be for some time now. This is kind of a precedence to Greek culture, so this next section is going to be fairly long. So what we're looking at here is the Bronze Age between 3300 to 600 BCE. We see Mesopotamia in this time, we see ancient Egypt, and we also see the Aegean, or the ancient Aegeans, which, again, is a precursor civilization to the Greeks. We've got Stone Age, right? We talked about that, so that's the Stone Age, which basically means the use of stone and other earth materials, or natural materials. Then we've moved into the Bronze Age about this time, about 3300, and that lasts until about 1300. We're in the Bronze Age, which basically means that they understand bronze. That's what they use for their natural material, that they're able to smelt it, not dealt it, but smelt it, right? And then we're going to move into about 1300, we move into the Iron Age, which basically is widespread until they build, so bronze is widespread until the ability to smelt iron ore. By smelting it, it removes impurities and regulates the amount of carbon in the alloy that's developed. So that kind of gives you perspective as far as where we're at.
Bailey Young to the office, please.
Here's a map of the ancient Aegean area. We don't know a whole lot about these people, but we know that they were most likely farmers and herders, or seafarer folk. We're going to talk about 3 different cultures: the Cyclades, the Minoans, and the Mycenaeans, Mycenaeans. So if you look here, we've got, the Cyclades would live here, the Minoans typically lived in Crete, and then we would have the Mycenaeans over here, which then in turn this ends up becoming Greek. So where are we at? So here are the 3 different explanations of the times. The Aegean, the term is used to describe the Bronze Age that occurred in the land in and around the Aegean Sea that I just showed you. So the Cycladic people ruled about 3000 to 1600. They produced stylized nude standing females. We're finally seeing nudes in art, and nude males playing instruments. We've got the Minoans between 1900 and 1375. They built mixed palaces with complex grounds. So basically meaning there's a lot of rooms. It's very complex, and it's almost like a labyrinth in itself. And the Mycenaeans, 1600 to 1155, they built massive citadels marked by cyclopean masonry and corbelled vaulting, which we've already talked about. We'll talk more about that too. So the first group of people we're going to go into are the Cyclades Islands, or the Cycladians. The Cycladic Islands of the Aegean were the first inhabited by voyagers from Asia Minor around 3000 BCE. So if you look over there to the east, the northeast, that's Asia Minor. We've talked about that. We've talked about Asia Minor a lot. Prosperity was achieved thanks to the wealth of natural resources on the island. So they had a lot of gold, silver, copper, obsidian, and marble. They used hillside burials, so they were still very focused on burials in the afterlife, or more of death anyway. And they were the first people to start clay works. Or not first to start clay works, but they really honed that skill. Again, these are the pre-Greeks, so of course clay is going to be very important to them. So around 3000 BCE, they begin sculpting in marble. So here are some marble figures. These are classic, I always have a hard time with this word, Cycladic art. These figures here on the left are meant to be laying down. We see that V-shape shoulder and V-shape genitalia that you've seen. Where else have we seen that? I'm not going to tell you. You got to think of it on your own. Again, meant for burial. It's these people in this area were rich in natural resources. They used lots of marble and very geometric. The heads are always facing up. So you see the geometric, this gentleman sitting right here, that is a harp that he's playing. So Cyclopean masonry ends up being used for a long time. They use minimally cut blocks that are stacked without mortar. So what is this called? We learned about it already in Stone Age. ... It's corbelled vaulting. The term's right there on your screen for you. So basically, this corbelled vault is a type of vaulted space in which blocks of stone are gradually placed closer together as the building rises, forming a V roof. This was done in either dry mason, or this would be considered dry masonry because it's without mortar. So now we're moving on to Crete. So about 1900, 1300 BCE, they traded a lot for their bronze. Very large trade power due to the location. They were called the Minoans due to King Midas. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of King Midas. Very, very naughty man. Developed a script called Linear A, which is non-translatable. Eventually, Linear B came from Greece. They worshipped 3 goddesses. Women had a very important, if not dominant, role in Minoan religion, which obviously is not seen very often throughout culture or history so far. We would see images of women and snakes as far back as 6000 BCE. The snake is considered to be some sort of health or apothecary symbol, and we still use that symbol today in the healthcare field, right? The cross with the snake through it. Not sure if it is a central image or just the one that is found. However, the woman with the snake image is known to be very, very old. Like I said, over 6,000 years ago. The snakes are connected to welfare of the house and of underworld. So again, that's where that meaning comes from. So if we look here, ta-da! We have our first nude, funnily nude frontal of a woman. So these are some characteristics of Minoan art. We've got, there's a very fluid figure. If you look up here at the right at these landscapes, it's very fluid. It's very whimsical. Even the figure on the lower right is whimsical. The figures enjoy free movement. They're not stuck on one ground line. We've got curved lines which dominate the composition. Again, we're talking about that narrative up in the top, upper left-ish. We've got S-shaped curves, which are very common. They introduce pure landscape, very lush vegetations with no human presence. So on their frescoes, which is called a fresco, which basically means paint on plaster or stone, this is typically what you see. When you do see men and figures, the men are typically painted darker than the women. That's how you know one's female and one's male. Men they're very influenced by Minoan art. The figures have small waists, broad shoulders. Or I'm sorry, that should be influenced by Sumerian art. I apologize. So bueno fresco. That term is called true fresco. Bueno fresco means basically paint applied to fresh plaster, so it's still wet plaster. That would be true fresco, or even just fresco. It's much more durable because then the paint mixes with the plaster. So you see here we've got the women and we've got the men. The men are painted darker than the women. The bulls, again, are seen as sacred forms. I'm not going to show you this, but I fully expect for you to watch this as you're watching this overview. So make sure you go and you watch the ancient Minoan and Aegean Empire. And of course, I'm kidding. Oh, I'm sorry, let's go back here real quick. So, bueno fresco comes from the Italian word for true fresco. That's where it comes from, is true fresco. We've got the Crete video. We're not quite sure if the Minoans were forced out the Mycenaeans or not, but something happens, and then here, boop, the Mycenaeans come into play. So, what they give us is the corbelled vault. We've seen this before, again, in Stone Age art, but this is the largest room for over hundreds of years. When the Mycenaeans fell, Greece went into the Dark Age. So they kind of cultivated a lot of work that they saw around. So they stole a bunch from the Cyclopeans and from the Minoans, and then the Mycenaeans just kind of combined it all or used it all. It's kind of like what the Romans did. So this is Cyclopean masonry. This is considered a corbelled vault, influenced by Minoan art. Figures have small waist and broad shoulders. They moved away from Minoan dialect form and into a more realistic form. Okay, that is ancient Aegean in a nutshell. Woo! Okay, now we're going into Chapter 5, Greece. This is when the heavy-duty information comes into play. So we literally just went through Chapter 4 in 10 minutes, guys. Awesome job. So, ancient Greece, or Greece. Remember that after the fall of the Mycenaeans in 1200 BCE, Greek culture went through a dark age. So once they died, everybody forgot how to do a lot of stuff, which they began to build back up around 8th century BCE. So the Dark Age, we've got what we see as a deconstruction of Mycenaean palaces, the disappearances of kings, loss of knowledge. They forgot how to cut masonry, how to construct citadels and tombs, how to paint frescoes and sculpt in stone. So all of this was forgotten, how to be relearned. The Aeolians and Achaeans, the Ionians and the Dorians. So those are kind of the 4 areas that we see, or the 4 types of people we see in Greece. The Dorians and Ionians are the main political partisans. So we talk mostly about the Dorians and the Ionians. Oops, didn't mean to do that. There we go. Greeks called themselves the Hellenes. They were a mix of Indo-European and Aegean people. So Indo-European people kind of came down, migrated in, and shebang shaboom kind of slept with the Aegean people, and there you go. Then you've got the Hellenes or the Greeks. They established city-states, or polis, P-O-L-E-I-S. They created the concept of democracy, or demos. They owned Socrates, which philosophical discussion. They owned Plato, who formulated his prescription for the ideal form of government called the Republic. You guys should probably already know a lot of this by now. They formed the Olympic Games, acknowledged that they borrowed ideas and skills from older civilizations. They owned slaves, and women were in no way equal. A lot of times the women were left in the house to do wifely duties, is what we'll call it. These are the Greek time periods. So there are 2, 4, 6. We've got geometric period, which is between 900 to 700 BCE. We have the Orientalizing art between 700 and 600. Archaic art, 600 to 480. Classical art, 480 to 400. Seems really small, but classical art is it's what has been mimicked throughout the entire rest of the ages. And then we have late classical art, 400 to 323, and Hellenistic art between 323 and 30. When we start into classical art and on into Hellenistic, that's when people really start to consider, or that cliched Greek art. So we're going to start talking about the geometric period. This is called an amphora. This is a term. Yes, this is a term, so you might want to write this down. So this is called geometric or orientalizing period. During this period, a lot of the design qualities were mimicked because of trade. So that's also why it's called the orientalizing period. It's almost exclusively covered in abstract motifs. We've got human figure is highly stylized, no depth of space. Amphora is a 2-handled jar used for the storage or transport of usually wine, oil, dried fish, and kind of other commodities. So an amphora is a 2-handled jar. What we're seeing at the very top of this jar, or this pitcher, or whatever you want to call it, this vessel, we've got a meander pattern, or a key pattern. That is very stylistic of the Greek people, so you need to note that. This vessel is about 3 feet tall. It's a funerary vessel. The bottom of the crater was open.